Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the History Archive, the podcast in which I talk about historic events from the past 120 years and how they influence history and our current world. In today's episode, we are going to be talking about, the role of aircraft carriers in the naval war of World War II. After World War I, that was full of huge battleships hurling shells at each other until one side was entirely destroyed, World War II turned into a naval war in which a very large emphasis was laid on the submarine, as we discovered in the first two episodes of the show, and on the aircraft carrier as a new weapon in naval warfare. Battleships had been outdated at the time. A special reason for this was the fact that on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, destroying or heavily damaging the entire US Navy battleship fleet. However, on the day, no aircraft carriers had been present at the harbor. This meant that from a fleet of battleships, there became a fleet of aircraft carriers. The attack on Pearl Harbor had not come out of anywhere, for the Japanese had been on an imperial war for a long time by 1941, threatening the superiority of the Americans in the Pacific. As a diplomatical consequence, the Americans put an oil embargo into effect against Japan. A modern war needs oil, especially for warships, tanks, and other weapons. So the Japanese conquered even more land, explicitly Dutch India, which was a very large oil resource at the time, to provide for its oil needs during the war. The logical consequence was Pearl Harbor, as America and Japan's diplomatic strategies were intensely clashing at the time. The US wanted to stop Japan from expanding in the Pacific, and Japan, of course, wanted to keep its expanding going, which could have eventually led to the total dominance in the entire Far East. The main goal of Pearl Harbor had been the rapid extinction of the entire Pacific fleet and also part of the naval air force, or the naval aircraft of the time, and the air force in the region. For Pearl Harbor had been a very important base for the Americans. Aircraft carriers were a relatively new weapon at the point in time in 1941. They'd only been in service for a couple of years, or in successful service, for in World War I, everything had still been dominated with battleships. There had been a few experiments, most notably the USS North Carolina in 1916. You can look at that in the documentary that I have linked. And if you are wondering, I didn't give you a book today. I didn't use one concrete book for the research of this episode. I mainly used the internet. I did use one book, a little, and I have of course left a link in the show notes to where you can get it. And I have also of course left some links to documentaries that I have used. And the USS North Carolina was an experiment in 1916. She had one major flaw. She could only launch aircraft. She didn't have the capability to have aircraft land on her. And this immediately brings us to one challenge. How do you launch an aircraft from a moving ship? The North Carolina in the day solved it by building a catapult. A catapult with pulleys and wires that were connected to a cylinder that would be filled with compressed air that would launch the aircraft. These days you have different methods. On the USS Nimitz, for instance, we have a steam launcher, and on the more recent development of the USS Gerald Ford, we have a electromagnetic launcher. There is quite a few interesting projects on the internet, most notably from Tom Stanton, at least that I could find, on recreating this magnetic launcher. It is quite interesting how this works, so go check it out. Another challenge was that you had to somehow land the aircraft on the ship. And if you imagine a normal ship, normal military ship if you want, you don't have a lot of space on the deck. If you remove all the guns from the deck of a normal battleship, then you still have the command tower, the funnel and whatnot. That's what we call the superstructure. So how do you shift the superstructure? Japanese carriers sometimes solve this problem by removing the superstructure altogether, having just a flat-topped carrier. There was no tower on it whatsoever. Most notably the light carrier Shoho. But you need a tower usually on a carrier. That's why all modern day carriers have towers, because you need to have an overview over the flight deck, and you of course also need a bridge from where you can control the ship and make tactical and strategical decisions, especially during such intensely fought naval battle as the Pacific War. So the problem of the superstructure was solved by moving the entire superstructure to starboard, or to the right side if you will, which you can imagine leaves an imbalance on port, so the entire ship will list to starboard. Now you might wonder, well, that can't be healthy for landing and starting aircraft. It wasn't. So they had to take countermeasures to prevent the ship from listing like that. And the idea they came up with was to physically extend the hull of the ship. They basically did it by pushing the material outward and creating a large dent on the port side. And then they filled a lot, and then they put a lot of heavy weights onto the port side of the ship. That was how they created a stable ship that could have a very long and clear flight deck for starting and taking off. So this brings us to our last problem. We now have a way of launching the aircraft. We have a long flight deck where we can theoretically land an aircraft on, but we don't have a mechanism to stop an aircraft once it has landed. So this problem was solved by installing so-called arrestor wires. These were wires that span the entire width of the deck and would be caught by a hook installed on the rear of the plane. So all planes that were supposed to land on the carrier would have a rod that they could extend upon landing, a little bit like a landing gear. And at the end of this rod there would be a hook. And the aim of the game would be to bring your aircraft in and land on the flight deck, and to stop you would have to engage one of these arrestor wires. There were several, always lined up after each other. And when you caught one of these wires with your hook that was hanging down at the rear end of your aircraft, you would start stopping, because these wires were connected to a system that would increase the resistance until the aircraft would be brought to a stop. And this all would be done on a space of 251 meters, which is quite impressive considering that it takes an at least 1 kilometer long runway to stop an aircraft in a normal airfield. The arrest wires also solved another problem quite neatly, because at the time you stored aircraft on an aircraft carrier by putting them in the so-called hangar of the aircraft carrier. It's a little bit like a hangar in a normal airfield, and the hangar was always situated immediately below the flight deck. You would then move them by elevators on the port and starboard side of the ship. Probably seen them if you've watched Top Gun. So now, with the arrestor wire system in place, you can also actually put aircraft on the deck, because you don't need the entire length of the flight deck anymore. You can put aircraft on the far side of the flight deck, so you can increase the number of aircraft that an aircraft carrier can carry, which is of course a strategical and tactical advantage in such a heated naval battle as the Pacific War was. All of this absolutely marvelous technical innovation was put to the test in the Pacific War, in which the Americans were in the defense after the attack on Pearl Harbor, because the Japanese were still on the offensive. The two fleets engaged, or at least part of the two fleets, engaged in what was the first ever naval battle that would be fought outside of the outer view of the other fleet. So one side wouldn't see the other. They only engaged each other over their various aircraft squadrons. This battle came about, or we today know this battle as the Battle at the Coral Sea. This came about because the Japanese wanted to establish control even further south in the Pacific to prepare a potential invasion of Australia, which never happened, and more immediately to capture the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. For this reason, they wanted to capture the port city of Port Moresby. An invasion force of several carriers by the Japanese was assembled to carry out the invasion. They were going to first land on the Solomon Islands and then at Port Moresby. The Japanese wanted to erect an airfield on the Solomons to gain air superiority, which would be an important strategical asset in the fight over Port Moresby. However, here come the famous American code breakers. They found out about the plan, and at the time Admiral Chester Nimitz, who has the honor of having an entire aircraft carrier class named after him, realized the necessity to defend in the Coral Sea to stop the Japanese advance now, because he knew that if he lost even more control, it would be even harder to strike back in the long run. So the Americans let the Japanese take control of Tulagi, one of the Solomon Islands, and the plan was to attack during the Japanese unloading their equipment on Tulagi. The attack failed due to the Douglas SBD-3 Dauntless dive bombers bomb sites clouding up. After the attack on the Tulagi invasion force, the Japanese realized that the American fleet of carriers must be nearby. Over the next day, the two fleets almost met in the Coral Sea, but due to the inaccurate surveillance of the Japanese, this did not come to pass. The Japanese search for the Americans intensified after that day, but instead of finding the US task force with the two carriers, but instead the Japanese only found an American fleet tanker and an escorting destroyer which had become detached of the task force for security reasons. The Japanese attacked both of these auxiliary ships, destroying both of them. In the meantime, the Americans were also surveilling the skies above the Coral Sea, frantically searching for the Japanese fleet. A pilot reported that he had found the Japanese invasion force. Because of this message, the commander of the American task force launched a huge airstrike at the location the pilot had reported. While the attacking aircraft were still underway, the surveillance pilot who had reported the location landed on the carrier and denied having seen an aircraft carrier. He had instead only found a small fleet of destroyers and cruisers. The commander decided not to call off the attack, a decision that would pay off as the American attack they discovered the light carrier Shoho and sank her. This left both sides with relative precise knowledge of the opponent's location, as the Japanese now knew the relative range in which the American fleet must be in relation to the aircraft that had attacked and sunk the Shoho. The ensuing battle left both sides with severe losses. The aircraft carrier USS Lexington was sunk by the Japanese torpedo bombers Kate and the Japanese dive bombers Val. These are the American code names. But in turn, the Americans sank one carrier and damaged another severely, stopping the invasion of the strategically important Port Moresby. The Japanese would later try to conquer Port Moresby by land, which also ultimately failed. The battle left the Americans with one aircraft carrier lost and one damaged. The Japanese were left with two missing carriers and one sunk. You might argue that in spite of this, the Americans had taken in a severe blow because of the loss of the fleet tanker, but all in all, the Japanese came out of this battle as losers, especially as these aircraft carriers would be missing in the pivotal battle at Midway a couple of weeks later. This battle came about because the Japanese launched a supposed surprise attack at the American bases at Midway. The Americans had in precaution brought their aircraft carrier fleet to the islands and were successful in striking back the attack. Another very notable battle in the Pacific War was the invasion of Guadalcanal by the Americans, which would go down as one of the bloodiest battles in the entire naval war of World War II, because of the severe territorial disadvantages the Americans had to face when they were trying to conquer the island, as the Japanese fighters hid in the jungle and launched surprise attacks, leaving many Americans dead. So all of this brings us, of course, to an interesting question that I would like to pose at the end of this episode. And I wanted to show with the example of the aircraft carrier how fast one technology can make another technology be obsolete. And this is a theme, of course, in military history, because it usually leads to opposing powers rivaling each other in ever more destructive technologies, trying to go from bigger to the biggest possible weapon or the most destructive weapon, which also works for the defensive. If I build an ever better missile, then you might build an ever better counter weapon, if you know what I mean, like a anti-missile rocket that can intercept attacking missiles. So if we keep on like this, with technologies getting ever better and opposing each other, then the question is if we will ever end in a sort of stalemate when we can't push the scientific envelope any further. Which is a quite interesting question to ask at the end of this episode, in which I try to lay a narrative on how technology becomes obsolete. Because the question is if an aircraft carrier might one day also become obsolete. If we can build small enough drones that land on small enough amphibious assault ships, which are sort of smaller aircraft carriers, that we don't need large aircraft carriers anymore. There are certain developments in that region already, and the question is if this will continue in the future. And another point that you might think about is the general theme of technologies becoming obsolescent. We will talk about this in another episode. I don't know if it's already released or if it is still coming, because I don't know yet in which order the episodes will release currently. In that episode we will talk, or we have talked, about steam locomotives, which is quite a good example for how technology can boom at one point in time and be entirely obsolescent and a museum piece at another. Which is also an interesting thing to think about in the context of society. How does technology change society and economy, not just military aspects? And I hoped that this narrative was brought to you in an interesting way and illustrated on the example of the aircraft carrier in this episode of the History Archive. And if you want to read and inform yourselves further, I have of course left a couple of links in the description or the show notes, depending on whether you are watching this on YouTube or listening to this as a podcast. And of course I will always keep you up to date over the History Archive WhatsApp channel. I hope you enjoyed this radio program / podcast. My name is Noah Bayer, and I hope you still have a good day, and we will see or hear each other in the next episode of the History Archive. Bye!